I'm Kim McIntosh, and this lesson is about cell division. Our objectives are to describe the cell cycle, explain the difference between when the cell is growing compared to when it's dividing. We're going to walk through every phase of mitosis and then each phase of meiosis and talk about what's different between those two processes. We are going to talk about why we need mitosis and why we need meiosis. And then we're going to talk about cytokinesis and how that's different between animal cells and plant cells. All right, so we're going to start off with the cell cycle. This graphic is pretty good at describing or showing the actual cell cycle. So if you'll look right here, I'm going to start with this first growth phase. This is G1. Now, this is a cycle, so we tend to not say that a cycle has a start place and an end place. So you really need to think of this as being continuous. It just keeps going on and on. But to have this make sense, we're going to start here with the G1, which is the growth and normal metabolic roles. So in this G1 phase, which is part of interphase, the cell is just growing and doing its normal things and making proteins. The second phase right here is the S phase. This is where the DNA is replicated. This is called the synthesis phase. So during this portion, the cell is copying the DNA. Then we have what we call a G2 phase. So this is a second growth phase. It's almost like the cell is resting, getting ready to go into mitosis. And so in this phase, there's still some growth, there's some metabolic activity going on here. And you'll notice that all three of these, G1, S, and G2, are part of interphase. So this entire part of the process we call interphase. And a cell spends 90% of its time in interphase. So most of the cell's life is basically growing and performing normal metabolic processes. But then we have this mitotic phase, or where we go into mitosis. And this is where the cell is going to duplicate. So just as a side note, before we get into mitosis and everything that is involved with that, I want to go through basically why mitosis. Okay, so mitosis is cell replication, and when we talk about mitosis, we're talking about somatic cells. Now, somatic cells are all the cells in your body except for the gametes, and gametes would be sperm and egg cells. So the somatic cells are basically your non-reproductive cells. Somatic cells would be your liver cells or your skin cells or your muscle cells. So all of those cells are going to go through this process of mitosis. Okay, so now let's get into this process of mitosis. The mitosis has 4 different stages. So those stages are prophase, metaphase, anaphase, and telophase. And the cell really does not spend very much time in this part of its life. So if you notice from the graphic here, it looks like for mitosis, it's only about 9% of the cell's life. Most of the cell's life is spent in interphase, but then about 9% of the cell's life is spent in mitosis. Again, before I go into this whole process of mitosis and how this happens, I want to talk a little bit about chromosomes, because here I showed you that there's a synthesis phase. That's the DNA replication. So that's actually part of interphase where the cell is making a copy of the DNA. And so I want to show you a little bit about that first before we move on, so that you'll know that this part of the process is already done before we go into mitosis. So from the cell, we have the nucleus inside the cell, and you remember this from when we were talking about the cell structures and organelles. Well, inside that nucleus, we have the chromosomes, and the chromosomes are made up of the DNA. So on the left here, we have the unduplicated chromosome. So that would be basically what the cell would be like when it's in the G1 phase. It would have this set of unduplicated chromosomes. But once it goes through the S phase, it's going to have duplicated chromosomes. And so what we see with the duplicated chromosomes is we have a centromere here that links them together, still have the genes on each part of it, and we have what we call sister chromatids. So this is a sister chromatid here. Let me get rid of that. So we have a sister chromatid here, and we have a sister chromatid here. And basically these are just the matching ends of the chromosome. So these genes on this part right here match up to these genes on this part right here. Okay, so let's talk about the phases of mitosis now. The first phase of mitosis is prophase. So that's shown right here. And prophase is where the chromosomes, you see the chromosomes right in here in the middle. These become more condensed and we're able to see them under the microscope. Each one of those is duplicated chromosomes, so we see the sister chromatids and they're joined by a centromere. On this graphic, it shows late prophase here going into metaphase, and this is really just to talk about that nuclear membrane disappearing. And during metaphase, the chromosomes, they line up in the center here. So they basically are moved to the center, and the centrioles, which you can see over here, those centrioles right there, they have what's called spindle fibers, and those spindle fibers are attached to those chromosomes, and that's what's pulling them towards the center of the cell. The next phase that we're going to talk about is anaphase. So that one is shown right here. And what happens here is those chromatids, those sister chromatids, they actually separate at the centromere. And so those are starting to be pulled towards either side, but they've broken apart now. So instead of being this little X shape right here, we see them as a little V shape. So those V shapes right there are being pulled towards either side of the cell. And then the final phase of mitosis is telophase. And in telophase, what we see is that those chromosomes start to uncoil, so they're not condensed anymore, and the nuclear membrane reforms around those chromosomes. And so we start to see this division of the cell, and then each one of these is going to have a nucleus. But the end result of mitosis is 2 copies of the cell, and those copies are genetically identical. Okay, so let's recap. The purpose of mitosis is that it allows growth, repair, and replacement of cells. It produces every kind of cell in the body except for the gametes. It produces 2 daughter cells, and those daughter cells are genetically identical to the parent cell and to each other. And that's really important because if you're making skin cells or you're making liver cells, you want those cells to do the job that they're supposed to do. And so you need those to be genetically identical and have the instructions that will tell them to be a liver cell or that will tell them to be a skin cell.